just fine. So just so you know, it is now on. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump on in here. A couple of housekeepings, I'll leave it up. Again, these are some of just a couple of the statements that led me to do some deeper thinking. So if you'll just take a quick moment and read through some of these and maybe share some of your own reflections or pieces that stood out to you. This is an article that I was reading over the weekend that I found a lot of value in. I will also put that in the Padlet, but I wanted to pass it along. There's some valuable information in this one as well, and that's from the Journal of Psychology. So one of those, looking here at the lower one, that use of technical language, and gosh, I think this kind of crosses all of our service spaces. What I have found helpful is having that one, just making sure that our language is optimized for translation and targeting the populations that we're serving, but also having a breakdown sheet, especially in schools. One of those pieces of technical language that can be really complicated, and we have a lot of acronyms, especially in the educational system. So having something right at the front office that breaks down those acronyms for translators and for parents and families coming in can be really valuable. And this was an interesting one up on top here that I thought about, looking at migrant children and youth in particular, and just wondering if anyone else has any connections to either of those statements here or responses. Once again, I took the name off, but if you'd like to claim either of these as yours, feel free, but see if anyone can speak to these.
Well, mine is obviously the first one, since I'm in migrant education. But I think the one thing that I would have, like, that I thought of afterwards that I would have added is, you know, like really good training for teachers in understanding how exhausting it is for children to be operating in a language that, you know, isn't their primary operating language. Like, you know, a real understanding of, like, that is a level of exhaustion that teachers, you know, need to be aware of. Like, the child needs to be able to take breaks and, you know, recover from that level of exhaustion.
Great point. I absolutely agree, but it's a great point, and one that we very rarely mention or touch on. And even when we're talking about best practices for multilingual education, I don't think I've ever seen that come up in a talk or training or professional development or other settings. So it's a great point to make. Okay, let's go ahead and head in for today. Today we're going to just quickly create and recall a foundation around transition shock. And let me back up. Thank you all for sharing your responses from 1 and 2. We're going to recognize, again, go back to the intersectionality between trauma and culture, and then develop a bank of resources. And we're touching on this trauma-informed piece simply because when our spaces are safe and we create that foundation of trust and safety, we're in a much better position to create spaces for learning or spaces for integration. So in whatever your capacity, you can work toward creating a more power restorative service space. And when I talk about power restoration, we talk about this in the sense that I really tend not to focus strongly on the trauma. We tend to focus more on the future. So I feel that for me, that difference is really critical, right? Focusing on the trauma really roots us in the past, whereas this idea of restoration of power, the thinking that this power belongs to a person, it's theirs innately, we can have a role in assisting and restoring that power, but the power is never really gone, right? A person's power or strength, but it can be interrupted. It can be interrupted by different aspects of transition shock, along with a lot of other things. So culture shock can interrupt that, stress and anxiety can interrupt that, and then day-to-day factors, of course, can interrupt that as well. And just as a reminder, where we've already been in this talk of transition shock, so when I use this language, those are the aspects we're talking about. In a service base, particularly in let's say education, most of my work has been in classrooms. So what I would tend to see are any of these sort of manifestations presenting for those individuals that have had experiences with transition shock, including culture shock. And here's the thing, right? All kids manage stress. All kids face stress. All humans face stress, and dealing with stress is normal and natural. But when a person's ability to manage that stress becomes overwhelmed, we may run into these sorts of manifestations. And when I see 2 or 3 presenting, I'm not at all concerned. I present with any number of these on any given day. My children present with any number on any given day. However, when I start to notice a large number of observable indicators for transition shock occurring throughout a span of time, or when I'm noticing, say, 3 or 4 that are presenting consistently on a daily basis or an hourly basis, I'm starting to kind of raise my flags a little and take some notes and really be more intentional about creating some trauma-informed spaces, or some spaces that are mitigating transition shock in culturally responsive ways. So let's go back a minute to that intersection of identity. We know, as we've already talked about, the transition shock, like other aspects of a person's identity, intersects with all the other features of one's identity. In a service space, we run into some challenges, right? Particularly around the language and how that translates. But we often also run into challenges with our westernized way of managing mental health, or what we think should happen for a person, versus what some of our families might look at as how they prefer to manage mental health or talk about mental health. We have issues like historical and intergenerational trauma. We have gender challenges, and how certain genders are expected to present in terms of their emotions or their feelings. We have location, one where a person maybe originated from, and what sorts of services or deeply embedded cultural lenses are there, but also where they are here and what sorts of services, what sorts of training for folks that are working with them are available in the area that they are now. So transition shock is intersecting with all of these other pieces, and it's also intersecting and overlapping with all of the other features of a person's identity, if that's their sexuality, if that's their social economic status, whatever that might look like. So again, when we're talking about just as trauma, culturally responsive pedagogy should be overlapping with instruction, should be overlapping with healthcare, should be overlapping with resettlement processes, should be overlapping with URM foster care. It should also be overlapping with trauma-informed practice. In most cases, and particularly in schools, that's really not happening. So we have in a lot of cases, some really robust trauma-informed trainings and strategies that work, but they're not necessarily trauma or culturally responsive. They're siloed out. So we're working to bring those 2 together and bridge them together. As we move through today, if you're thinking about strategies you're already using, if you might pause to consider how those might also be culturally responsive or not, and maybe what changes can be made to bring this a little bit closer together. Many of the trauma-informed tools and resources that we have can hinge on that area of multicultural, and that they might bring in some of those elements. But again, those are the surface level elements, right? Those are not necessarily culturally responsive pieces. This is just my favorite thing, this guy bouncing around. There has to be something that I'm hitting that's making this happen. So just as a reminder, when we're talking about culturally responsive education, we're rooted in rigor, we're rooted in cognition, and we're really drilling down into those deeply embedded aspects and looking at the reference points from which an individual views a certain experience. We came all the way down from race to ethnicity and nationality and heritage and culture. We came all the way down into culture to find that deeply rooted layer. All of the trauma-informed or the transition shock strategies that we'll talk about touch on one or more or many others. Of course, those deeply embedded layers of culture are absolutely limitless. We just took a moment to spotlight these 5 because they tend to show up in our service spaces frequently, but of course they're how we look at age, say, or the process of aging, or how we care for elders. All of those are also deeply embedded layers of culture. So again, they're limitless. These are just some examples, but if all of the strategies that we'll touch on also stick to one or more of these deeply embedded cultural influence learning structures. We're going to take just a minute, about 3 minutes. This video is in the module 3. There are 4 selections of videos. It's actually about an hour long, but we're going to listen to about 3 minutes of it. It's a great training, but it is available on YouTube and it's in the module workshop. So we'll just listen as our presenter just touches on this one little portion here, and then we'll discuss it after. Let's go back a little bit here.
Has the audio started? I'm not hearing it.
Yes, can you hear it?
I can't. Can anybody else?
No, I just have a photo of a little child in diapers and no audio.
Okay, I'm hearing it clearly, so I wonder what that is all about. And if not, we can go back in. I can kind of walk through what she's saying here. See if I can go back and put it on subtitles. Are you able to see the subtitles?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, let's try that, and then I'll see if I can figure this out.
Okay.
Oops. I know that was maybe a little complicated, just having the subtitles there. But this idea of this critical cultural process is one that we will keep coming back into. What you see and experience, what your first reactions are, the cultural meaning that you assign to it from your own cultural lens, whatever emotional response that evokes, and then the decisions we make out of that. And the same is happening on our students' end or on our clients' end, that they're also seeing something, they're assigning cultural meaning to it, they're having a response, and then their actions are coming out of that. This article that I just shared at the beginning that I'll drop in a Padlet talked a lot about this, especially folks coming into the US healthcare system that are arriving from refugee and immigrant backgrounds, and the cultural meaning that they're assigning to things versus our cultural meaning that we're assigning to things, and how much that comes into conflict. So this, of course, applies incredibly broadly. We in this session are going to continue to look at this critical cultural process as we're moving through our trauma-informed care, and understanding from our lens, but also making an effort to understand a little bit more from the students' end or our clients' end, what that might look like as well. So let's move into our trauma-informed section, what I tend to call power restoration. So here are the 4 pillars. This is actually for clinical practice, but I find it works really well, and just laying a groundwork in other service areas, particularly in school settings, but also when we're talking again about resettlement, about foster care, about healthcare settings. So those 4 pillars are connect, protect, respect, and redirect. So we start typically at connect, at just building relationships, authentic relationships with our students or clients. We can move in once that groundwork of trust has been established into this area of protect. We talked a lot about risk factors and bolster and protect factors, which does certainly support integration, but it really is not only beneficial, but essential when we're talking about trauma-informed care. So cultivating safety and trust in the service space. Moving into respect, we talked about fostering choice and voice and collaboration, and then finally into this redirect, where individuals are able to redirect some of those energies and become a little bit more self-efficient and develop some sustainable practices here. So we'll begin with connect. We'll introduce what that looks like a little bit, a few quick strategies. We're going to move through this in a pretty speedy version today, and we'll just do 1 or 2 strategies for each one, and then we'll move into protect and so before we do any of that, these are kind of the non-negotiables. If I'm walking into a service space, a school building, a resettlement agency, these are the things I'm looking for right away, right? We're looking for that calm, organized environment. Moderated sensory stimuli, we'll talk about that a little bit more, and routine and predictability. Those are the 3 that we really have the most immediate control of. So let's look at, say, moderated sensory stimuli in a classroom setting as an example. So I used to have reduced sensory stimuli here, meaning that we try to have not too much going on the walls, right? If we have a unit or a project, it's fine to have those anchor charts up in those vocabulary, interactive word walls, and all the things that we're doing. But at a certain point, we need to take those down before we start putting new things up. We need to start reducing some of that additional space. For me, I like to have some kind of quiet classical music or something of the sort playing in the background while we're learning. For some of my students, that just doesn't work. I changed this to moderated sensory stimuli after several years in the classroom and really thinking about this, because some of my students I found really needed more. Moe needed to sit under my desk lamp and put her arms in the heat of the light and have that as a calming effect, to have an increase in pressure if a student is not at best, to have an increase in pressure putting Velcro strips under the desk, right? So all of those are increases. Some of my students do well with an increase in, say, technology or integrating that. It can kind of bring them down. For some of my students, they've already had a lot of technological stimulation in their home or other places, and having more in the classroom can lead to a sense of overwhelm. Routine and predictability, I can't say enough about, right? They lead to a sense of safety. Safety creates trust, and trust creates a space where individuals are more able to learn or to be in pro-social. Healthy collaboration and culturally responsive messaging, looking in a more broader way in the organization or the school or the district, and culturally responsive messaging. So those first three are the big like non-negotiables I look for in an immediate service space. In that pillar one, again, we're talking about building and maintaining authentic relationships. One of those, just in that connect, one of the first things we'll do as we come in is just kind of bringing us all into a space where we can calm down. One of the easiest ones I like to do is just the butterfly pats, which are a form of vagus nerve stimulation, right? And it, even for me, as I sit here, it calms me down a little bit, but just having that stimulation, even as we're talking or we're saying having our morning meetings or our greetings, just having that time together to bring ourselves into a little bit calmer service space, and we can get moving. This is another grounding activity that I use a lot for connection in any service space. I'll use again a school example for this. What I would invite students in this case to do then is to, on the hands, they can either draw their hand and write it, or they can just hold it up and name it, is to name adults on campus that they feel that they can trust, that they feel safe around. What I find early on is that individuals are sometimes not able to name any, or sometimes they have one or two. Maybe it's the basketball coach, or maybe it's the librarian, or maybe it's the after school person, whatever it is. But what we're working toward, and we do this check-in throughout the year, is to build up that hand, build relationships and community within. The same thing if you're a resettlement agency or you're a mental health care provider, having those individuals that a person feels they can come to and have an honest conversation with, right? Or they can go to feel safe, or be in the room and feel safe and not threatened. So identifying those individuals and building them up through our time together. And then in the middle, we talk about a place that they feel safe. If that's in a classroom, if that's in a wider school building, if that is in their community, if that's their mosque or their church or their home or whatever that looks like. In a school, I ask them to name a place specifically in the school that they feel safe. And what I find here is one, this tells me where they do feel safe, but it also opens some conversations about where students don't feel safe. So we've identified what areas are not on anyone's hand, right? And had some good conversations about why certain hallways don't feel safe, or what changes we can make to put more adults in a position of trust in certain areas where students don't feel like are safe spaces. So this is, again, building that connection. And this is also considered a grounding exercise. Bring your folks down. We talked last time about reciprocal behaviors and how difficult that can be, particularly for those who have experienced transition shock, not liking that ambiguity, right? Survival brain is all about black and white. We don't like the gray, weird in-betweens. So we want to move more into learning brain, or more into pro-social communication brain. We talked a little bit about what those might look like. Again, here are some examples from a trauma-informed perspective now, how we can start building up those serve and return actions and emotions behaviors. If you're interested in learning more about this particular topic, I've written about this before, so there's some links to other articles where those show up. Sharing personal artifacts in a safe space. Gameplay is really, really great for this. We mentioned standing in a ball and doing maybe a vocabulary toss back and forth. Miming is a great way to practice this serve and return, give and take. I put my hand up, you put your hand, and so on. So building up those reciprocal behaviors can help build up the area of connect. And they're all, does it really just go all the way back into it? And move us more into an area of protect. So I work recently. Jess is going bonkers. Love slide 5 today. So we might just be hanging out there. There we go. So the next we'll look at cultivating safety and trust in the service space. Again, all culturally responsive tools that link back to those areas of the deeper layer. We've already been through risk factors. We know what they are. They're not direct causes of transition shock, but they sure can contribute to it. Broadly speaking, the more risk factors an individual has, the higher the probability of experiencing transition shock, including trauma. I do not want to just broad base this or just make this a overarching thing. However, we know that those who have experienced transition or migration in any context are at a higher probability overall, not speaking to each individual, overall for experiencing trauma and transition shock. Protect factors, in a way, buffer against the effect of risk factors. And a trauma-informed capacity, that's really important because they have these insulating properties, right? They don't exclude a person from experiencing the trauma, but they can help buffer the effects against it. So let's see what some of those look like. Interactive self-portraits is a favorite one of mine. I will make a couple considerations here. In many cases, in Islamic culture, we tend to avoid art that includes any sort of person or living thing. So that's one culturally responsive aspect you may need to be aware of. Depending on your service base, for some individuals and families, it's fine, for others not. So it might be worth asking on that. But what we tend to do here is an individual will draw the outline of themselves. And in the inside portion, they'll write the things that they like or appreciate or respect about themselves. Those things that they feel proud of, or those things that they identify with in a positive way. Then we'll put those up and other individuals will move around and in the outside space, notice things that they see as positive pieces of that individual. A few trauma-informed considerations, going back to the black and white and no gray space. For some individuals, writing on their work can really cross the line of personal boundary and safe space. So there are a couple of different ways we move around that. One is we could talk about it. Two, we sometimes flip that paper over and students can write on the back. Or three, we use Post-it notes that can just be taken off by that student, but that don't actually write on the work. And I prefer to use Post-it notes when I'm working with students. And this helps build some of those relationships in the class. It helps students work through some of those really challenging reciprocal give and take behaviors in a safe service space. So just as a few examples, the one on the right are high school students, and they're working, theirs is really kind of a culturally influenced. This is a newcomer school in Texas, in Fort Worth. And then this is a young student that I was working with. It was a group of first graders, kindergartners going into first grade. And so these are the things that the student really likes about herself, and then the things that other students in our really small working group were recording on her chart of right now. And so again, as a trauma-informed tool, this can be grounding, culturally responsive matches with recall devices, storytelling, those pieces. And again, here's an example of the Post-it notes that I would certainly recommend for those individuals who may benefit from that, or just for whole class. Transition cues, gosh, this is across all service spaces, but certainly in a school setting. So transition cues just help move from one space to the next. I know I keep going back to this area of gray, but anytime we move from one activity to another, or anytime we change from one room to another, or from one person speaking to another, all of that empty space in between is gray. That's all room for anxiety to grow. So we're working to minimize that, and to do it, we're giving folks a really clear idea of what is coming next. So in an adult learning space, we use this, say, with in a job skills training, and this is an example of wrote a note. I just dropped it on his desk and said, hey, just as a heads up, in 10 minutes, we're switching gears. We're moving on to something else. I might put this up on our whiteboard in the morning that says at 2 p.m. we have a choir concert that we're going to go to in the middle of math class, letting you know. And I'll put that up every so often, maybe every few hours, and it could be in the middle of a lesson, and I'll just pop a slide up that says, just a reminder, we're doing this. And I really find it helpful after a long break away from an individual. If you're, say, in a healthcare space and you are meeting with a client and there's a vacation time coming up, so you're Monday appointments are all canceled because it's the 4th of July, there's that break, that time where apprehension can build. So leaving a very clear note, I'll see you again at this time. Saying, I'm going to be here. I have every intention to be here waiting for you to see you again. I do this with all of my students before winter breaks, spring breaks, long weekends. Some students don't need it, but for those that do, to have a tangible reminder of this is what's happening, and I'll be here waiting for you when it's time to return. So those transition cues, they work really well in an online environment. We plug them in there in any service space, but certainly in a classroom over those long breaks. We'll move quickly into pillar 3, which we can think about as the area of respect, fostering choice and voice and collaboration. Two of the activities that probably many of us are already doing are guided choice in a school setting that might look like station activities or group rotations. In an adult learning space or a job space, I might say you have 3 things you need to do in the next 2 hours, but you can choose the order in which you need to get those done. Having that limited space, I try not to give more than 3 options because that can also be overwhelming. And sometimes I just start with 2. Here, do you want to sit in this space or this space? But having that element of choice. And scheduled interactions. We tend to do in our world a lot of, especially cooperative structures and cooperative talk. An example of that might be the think, pair, share, where you'll turn and talk to your partner and work on that together. But we can sometimes give those directions pretty quickly, and then students are just expected to do that. But those abrupt changes or partner pairs can also be overwhelming. So for many, I start with a predictive, I'll schedule a meeting in their day with this one person. I'm going to meet her every day at 10 o'clock to talk for 10 minutes on this topic, so that they know it's coming and can build up some stamina to move into those quicker meetings or quicker events. This definitely helps with high school and college and beyond, looking at interview times and being able to be prepared for those sorts of meetings and interactions, and being able to think quickly. But of course, when we're talking about those deeper layers of culture, we run into things like saving space or saving face. I'm sorry. So when we're turning to pair and talk quickly, we don't really have time to formulate what we want to think. It gives folks time to think about what they want to say and be ready to share that. This is a really fun one for high school kids. I love doing this for job training or for larger integration purposes, but also in the classroom, it works great. So from a cultural perspective, we've talked about this concept of time and what that means. Here in our culture, timeliness is considered a virtue, right? And that's not necessarily the same thing in all cultures. In many cultures, community and that aspect is considered a virtue much more than timeliness is. So this idea of time management does 2 things. One, prepares folks for what's expected of them under our sort of Western or Americanized framework, but also works to kind of diffuse some of that ambiguity and gray area and build stamina and practice for making those quick responses. I am just going bananas with this guy. And it just went all the way back to the beginning. Is there just a way I can slide it? No, there's not. There has to be a better system. There just has to be. So here's what that looks like. And I tend to do this in groups. If it's a classroom, I'll split them in half. If it's adults, 6 or more works great, but just so that there's a group involved. And so what I do first is just present a menu. And so the goal is, once they're in their groups, they'll need to look at this menu. They'll need to together decide who's going to kind of ringlead this, who's going to take the home, and then they need to create a plan, right? Are they going to knock off, say, all of the lower point items first and then work toward the bigger points? Are they going to go straight for the big points and then move down to the small points? And within their set time frame, whatever that is, 10 minutes is what I usually do. They want to try to gather as many points as possible by completing as many things. And I make them, lower stress activities that are more just fun, not necessarily heavily academic or heavily language based, right? And if we need sentence stems, then we have those available. So they're working to, again, just accumulate as many points as they can within their cooperative group. And the most important part of this is after those 10 minutes or so is this time of debriefing. So we talk about things like what group dynamics came into play and how did you work through them, and what would you do if you were doing this all by yourself, and how did you make decisions? What would you do to increase your efficacy? And we try this again several weeks later or a month later and just work towards seeing if we change our time, or if we get any better at those pieces, or if we make new progress in making decisions or cooperatively working together, or if we can talk about, if they're at a place that they can talk about what elements cause stress or where they felt some anxiety and how we can maybe work through those and see if that diffused at all. I'm tempted to just stop this right now and have some conversation just because I'm tired of going straight through. We're pretty close though. I really have no ideas why. Is anyone else familiar enough with Canva to know what the heck is going on?
I'm not. I haven't ever tried the presentation mode.
Well, this happens every time we're in presentation. I love presenting in Canva, but it just bounces around.
Huh.
We'll share just a couple other ones. The zones of responsibility, I love in any service setting. I use this for myself pretty regularly, actually. And what this looks like is just breaking, kind of compartmentalizing responsibilities in a person's world. So when we're sensing a lot of stress and overwhelm, what I'll do is pull an individual aside, or sometimes we'll do this as a whole group, but looking at where our responsibilities or our stressors are kind of clumped together. This first one here, the larger one, is one that I would use in a traditional school setting. The one on the right is one that I would use maybe if I'm working with adults or with parents. You'll also notice that they have different orientations. The self is on the different side for each one. And this is really, I use different ones depending on what I know is the language directionality. For example, Arabic, when we're reading at home, it reads from right to left, whereas we're looking from left to right. So looking at directionality and thinking what might be helpful for the folks you work with. There's lots of different options for what these buckets might look like. As educators or as teachers, I know that when I'm doing this, sitting with my colleagues on our planning time, we'll sometimes run through this, and that school bucket just gets absolutely out of control. So classroom and school might be completely bonkers, but then the self is really pretty neglected, right? And so when I'm talking about responsibilities of self, say you're working with a child that might be getting themselves dressed or brushing their teeth. Many of our students, particularly our immigrant populations, have a ton of home responsibilities, right? Including their homework and other things. But then many of them also are working outside of school to help with the home. They're taking care of younger siblings. They're helping with parents with cooking. They're doing that home bucket can be really kind of full. So we want to try to work on seeing where we can spread some of that out a little bit more. Maybe what responsibilities can be passed on, or what responsibilities might be able to talk to parents about, or what responsibilities they might be able to bring to school with them and have some support in school to help take care of, so that home bucket or whichever space is overfilling can start to see some relief. So doing things like this, once we're able to establish where those heavy areas of burden or stressors or anxiety fall, for parents, that especially refugee and immigrant parents, we often see a lot of responsibility in the home or the job area, but also in what I would call the community 1, community 2, the home community or culture. Even my husband as an immigrant is consistently and constantly working, right, to make sure that there's money going to Lebanon as well as taking care of his family here. So there's a split responsibility that can be overwhelming. So taking those avenues into consideration. And then finally looking at this last section here, this idea of redirecting or building some self-efficacy. This is a really simple one that I love to take along anywhere. This is with students, great for field trips or classroom practices. It works really well for adult learners or integration service spaces. And we start by just recording our name in the center, right? There's something really grounding about just writing something as familiar as one's own name. In the outside circle, we write down those things that in the instant that is consuming us, what things we can't control. So there's a stressor. Here's my name. These are the things that are just beyond my control in this particular situation and this particular stressor. And then we come back into this inside circle and we start just writing things we can control. This doesn't need to be in complete sentences. So we want to kind of reduce the language burden there. And this can also be in the students or clients' language of familiarity. So whatever those things are they can't control, whatever the things are they can control. And then from that inside bucket, we just pick 1 or 2 things we can take action on right away. As an example, I did this for myself. It was right at the beginning of COVID, and I was about to have a baby, and all my work stopped. My parents couldn't come to be around for the delivery, and they were saying maybe my husband couldn't come in, and I had another toddler I was just a bonker. So I wrote my name. Here's all the things I can't control, and here's the things I can control, and then took action on several of those things right away. And that was an element of, okay, I've got some footing here and I've got some things that are under my control, and I've just got to set that other stuff down for a minute. So again, this is one that we can really take along. Hands of Promise is another nice one to just work on moving again into the future and the idea of power restoration. This is working with a student. This was just a few months into the pandemic. She was a first grader going into second. And on her left hand, these are the things that she's ready to set down or that are kind of overwhelming for her in that moment. As you can see, this little guy here is the coronavirus bug. She has the mountain, she's crying, this is her teacher in her classroom on the computer. She's talking to her grandparents on a cell phone. And so she's just got a lot of things, but she's got some happy things. She's playing in the backyard, and those are her butterflies, but she's feeling a lot of kind of stress and anxiety in this time. So what we do is we write those things on the left hand. What we often do is thank those things for whatever they've helped us do. If we're in a position to see that yet, right? If they've helped us grow, if they've helped us learn something new, a new skill, of whatever that is, we say thanks, but I'm ready to set you down. And then looking to what things are you really excited for? Are you happy or looking forward to in the future? And she has the first thing on here, a plane. The rest of her family is all in Iran, and they've been separated by COVID and the distance. And so she's really excited to get on a plane and go see her grandparents and the rest of her family. The yellow building is the school opened again and her house. And so she's kind of envisioning this idea of her house and her school being connected again and being able to go back to what that was. So she's moving into this idea of these are the things she's looking forward to, but she's had some time to process and think about those stressors that she's ready to set down. We're going to skip through the DBT house, which is one of my absolute favorite exercises for now, but I will leave some notes, some other pieces in the module 3 or in the Padlet. I just want to touch on before we go today, this idea, you'll see this also in the module 3, of setting down this idea of resilience. It's a word that we hear all the time, especially when we're talking about trauma-informed care. But I would like to just propose that we look at this in a little bit different way. So it's not a bad word, but I will say that along the way, the idea of resilience has shifted, right? So it's kind of become this gray area. It's really become overused. In some cases, it's become politicized or weaponized, meaning it can take on kind of a have or have not quality. And can frame certain individuals in ways that make them feel or appear as less than. And this can really be true when we're talking about refugee and immigrant education and integration, but also when we're talking about looking at historical trauma or how many of our folks of color in our communities are sort of primed for that historical trauma in the communities that they're settled into or that they're living in. So in our module, there are some folks and resources that if you're open to exploring the idea or reading a little bit more as to why this might be something that's worth considering, those are in there. So the one thing I'd like to point out is there are some limitations of control, right? That suggest that there's a personal responsibility for outcomes that fail to take in some of those factors that are completely outside of a person's control. Again, when we're talking about our individuals, that could even be just where they were settled into. We heard about the jobs that are available. We heard about the transportation that is or is not available, the historical context that is there, or the historical trauma that is existing inside a family's home. So those limitations of control. There are limitations of context, right? It's contextual and it depends upon any number of environmental and interpersonal variables. And that there are limitations of equity. I just put that same one in there twice, I just saw, but there are clear limitations of equity when we're talking about resilience, especially when we're looking at that idea of it being sort of a have or have not quality. How is it that you were able to be so resilient? And this kid is so resilient, but then this one's not. So taking away, or at least considering what those limitations of equity might be. So again, when we talk about this idea of restoration of personal power over trauma-informed care, I would just like to invite you to consider this sort of thinking or idea that we are placing the individual in the driver's seat over their own outcomes and their own storytelling, centers that individual as the architect over their own plan and process for overcoming adversity from a culture responsive lens, and being able to bring those pieces that support their thinking, their knowledge, their funds of wisdom, and all of those other. This is occurring consistent with a person's own narratives, which of course include culturally responsive and deeply embedded aspects. We're going to stop there. There's tons of resources in that module 3 on this round of videos. So I just wanted to clarify, there is no reason that, I mean, there's like 4 hours of videos, just there's only one piece. If you want to choose more than one, that's great. But if you're able to look through at least one of those, share your thoughts and comments on that, that would be helpful. So let's stop sharing, get back in. Are there questions or comments on today, or I know we cursed through that, or on the module 2 or module 3 sections? This is our last live session. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out at any time. I will start on those professional development certificates this week, and I'll just keep my eye out as your responses come in and just send those your way. There's a Siri coming up on my computer that I didn't even know existed. It's translating all my words for me. Okay, well, thank you all so much. Are there any other thoughts or questions or comments before we end the session today? I'm going to stop the recording.
Well, thank you so much for the presentations. It's a really important topic, so I'll be happy to go and share with my coworkers what I've learned.
Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Louise. It was really interesting.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. It was great to have you. Okay, thanks. Bye, Jessica. Okay, bye-bye.